Hello, welcome everyone. We're just going to give another minute or so for people to join and then we'll start shortly. Thank you to so many who are joining us for our first ever webinar since the National AI Centre moved over to the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. It's really exciting to kick off this series again and connect with all of you. And I want to give a special kudos to a couple of folks who joined an hour early and 30 minutes early. I think it's a real testament to just how important responsible AI is. There is just so much opportunity with AI innovation, and we want to make sure that we get it right and that we're supporting businesses and communities to get it right. So thank you for the support. For those who may not have met me, I'm Stela and I lead the National AI Centre. And I'm based here in the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, Sydney. And here at the Department of Industry, Science and Resources offices, we are right near Darling Harbour. And many of you may know of Tumbalong Park. And Tumbalong means fishing spot in Gadigal. And what is really interesting is while Tumbalong means fishing spot, right next to us is also Barangaroo. And Barangaroo is a woman who was a leader in her tribe. She was also there when the first settlers were arriving in Sydney, but she also was a fisherwoman and she was fishing very regularly in these waters together with other women. And I was reading a lot about these narrow canoes that they would have, which would have, 3 kids on them and a little stove to make the fish, while obviously fishing for the broader community, and they were the key suppliers there. So I've really been enjoying learning more about the deep history and culture of First Nations. And so our department recognizes First Nations and their ongoing cultural and spiritual connection to the lands, waters, seas, skies, and communities. And we acknowledge First Nations peoples as the traditional custodians and law keepers and pay respects to elders past and present. And I also pay that respect to any First Nations peoples who are joining us today. So today, as I mentioned, first webinar to kick us off since National AI Centre is at the Department of Industry. And we are going to discuss 3 key things. One I'll kick off with is a little bit about Australia's responsible AI momentum. There's quite a lot of things on, and I'll just spend about 5 to 10 minutes touching on a couple of key things. Then I'm going to pass it over to Steve Nuttall from Fifth Quadrant, who will share more details about the Responsible AI Index. And I know that's why many of you have joined us today. The Responsible AI Index is now in its 3rd year, and I think the insights are so incredibly meaningful to how we support businesses to succeed with AI. So really excited about that. And then we're going to have a panel discussion. And so I'll introduce the panelists once we get closer to that time, but already start thinking about any questions that you may want to ask, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So jumping straight in, a little bit about the responsible AI momentum in Australia. I was reflecting that the National AI Centre has now been operating for just over 2.5 years. And from the start, we've had this theme of responsible AI. And so for us, the mission has not changed. It's around accelerating positive AI adoption and innovation that benefits Australia's business and community. And we do that in 2 ways. We do that by supporting the adoption of responsible AI across industries, and also by supporting the creation of AI in a responsible way. And we know that there is a real growing AI industry in Australia that is expanding. So while we have recognized that this was a key theme, we have heard very loudly from industry and from community that it's a little bit ambiguous what safe and responsible AI is, what are the actual tangible practices to take on. And this was actually the impetus for launching the Responsible AI Network. And these series are part of that Responsible AI Network. We go into topics such as the ones you see there in the hexagons. We go into these topics to deep dive into the practices that are needed to actually implement AI safely and responsibly. And we're very thankful for the 10 partners we currently have as part of the RAIN network, the Responsible AI Network. These partners are really committed to sharing that knowledge, developing the expertise and guidance, and then cascading it to those who are needing it so that we can make safe and responsible AI a reality. Again, AI really holds a lot of opportunity if we do it well. And so the intention of so much of our safe and responsible AI work is to enable innovation to be at the speed that it can be with those practices that are needed to do it safely and responsibly. Now, over the past year in particular, I've seen globally that there has been quite a convergence on how important responsible AI is. You would have heard it as, could be safe AI, responsible AI, ethical AI, trustworthy AI. I know there are various specific definitions and nuances, but it's this sentiment of doing AI well that is increasing the benefit for communities, for people, for environment, for business, while mitigating any risks and harms. And so I want to share a little bit about the momentum that's happened in Australia. And there's a series of brand new things that have been released over the last 1 to 2 months that I really hope that you dive a little bit deeper into and consider this as a teaser. So one of those that was just released last month is the Policy for Responsible AI Use in Government. It is a great document that structures in 3 core areas, some guidance and recommendation. Some parts of this are mandatory for public sector agencies, and some of those are recommended. And the key mandatory elements I've listed there. The first one is having an accountable official in that agency or department. And you can see that that is a requirement to be fulfilled by 30th of November. So that's a pretty bold step towards having that leadership accountability across the organization from a government perspective. The second compulsory element is a transparency statement. So that will be taking effect from 28th of February. And it's to disclose how the department and the agency may intend to use AI or where it might be engaging with the community, what kind of use cases, for what purpose, and just getting a little bit more transparent on that front. Each of these have much more guidance to double click, but I think it's important for you to know just how seriously responsible AI is taken across government, as well as the work we do with supporting industry. And so this is great work by the Digital Transformation Agency, bringing this together and collaborating broadly to make this happen. The second part is the National Framework for the Assurance of Artificial Intelligence in Government. And one of the things I really want to draw everyone's attention to are the logos on this document. It's every single state and territory across Australia collaborating with also the federal government. But I think it's a true testament for all the digital ministers across states and territory coming together to collaborate on a framework that would support safe and responsible AI outcomes. And I think this is important because there are no barriers. There are no geographical barriers to AI or digital. And so greater collaboration across Australia and also internationally is something that is important to enabling safe and responsible AI outcomes. This document is structured in in alignment with Australia's AI ethics principles, and it actually goes more deeply into each principle. One of those that I've listed there is reliability and safety. And then it very tangibly talks about the kind of practices to implement, such as, conducting pilot studies or implementing testing and verification and so on. So that's from the government side. Two things that were relatively recently announced, and I do encourage you to look further, and we may even have deep dive webinars to go into that. Just let us know. We're all about signals and learning from you about what you want to hear. Now, let's move to the area where the National AI Centre and the Department of Industry, Science and Resources are particularly focused in, which is helping industry to do AI safely and responsibly. And earlier this year, there was a broad consultation across Australia to really understand what was important and what we could be doing to enable safe and responsible AI outcomes. We received 500 submissions, and there was really a theme that emerged around the need to be agile, but also the recognition that our regulatory system right now, the legislation, it does not necessarily keep up or needs evolving in order to make sure that AI outcomes are safe and responsible. And so from that very, very broad consultation, which also spotlighted how important diversity and inclusion is, also how important it is to consider employee experience, job transformation, workforce and supply transformation, also First Nations, Indigenous data sovereignty. There were just so many themes that we needed to take action on, and 4 key actions were described. The first one is the Voluntary AI Safety Standard, which I'll briefly touch on, and my team is leading that. The second one is watermarking and labeling of AI-generated material. The third one is an expert AI advisory body. The temporary one has already been operational, and now we've received a lot of fantastic submissions for the new permanent advisory body. And the fourth element are the mandatory guardrails that might be considered for AI when it's used in legitimate high-risk contexts. So these are the 4 actions that were shared, and that were a direct result of the feedback that came from industry, from community, civil society, academia, and over 500 submissions. So I want to go a little bit deeper into the work that our team at the National AI Centre has been leading, and it's the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. So the Voluntary AI Safety Standard is all about helping organizations to have those practical details of how to implement AI safely and responsibly. It's about moving responsible AI from a theoretical realm into practical guidance. And it really has leveraged a lot of the best practices that we're already seeing around the country, some frameworks that already exist, as well as some of the international practices from organizations such as the International Standards Organization, NIST, IEEE, the EU through their AI Act and learnings, and just so many of the discussions and learnings from various forums such as the AI Safety Summits, the Bletchley Declaration, the Hiroshima AI Process, even the UN resolution on AI. So there's been a lot of reflection, consolidation, and looking into what are those leading best practices and agreement points that we have to enable the practical details of safe and responsible AI. And so what we started converging on during this development process are 10 voluntary AI guardrails, and we'll go into them very, very briefly. But these guardrails are probably not that mysterious to many of you who have been following this topic. You'll see themes such as governance come up, or responsible AI, risk assessment, or stakeholder engagement and consultation. It's the very themes that were emerging as part of the broad consultation and as part of the international consolidation of many frameworks and guidance. And for us, what we also recognize is that this is such a big undertaking that to enable us to actually release something that was of use as V1 in a timely way, we first focused in on this guidance being for organizations who are deploying AI. And so while the guidance is relevant for both deployers and developers of AI, this first version is mostly fleshed out for those who are deploying AI. This is where we heard the most need for guidance. This is also the reality of many businesses across Australia and around the world, is that they are probably most likely to be using AI services from someone else. Our next version, which we're actually just about to kick off the development and consultation for, will be focused on expanding the guidance to also include organizations who are developing AI, as well as evolving some of the deployment guidance based on the latest best practices. This is such an evolving landscape, and we have deliberately designed the Voluntary AI Safety Standard to be agile. There will likely be updates to this, every half year or so to ensure that the best practices are reflected and that businesses across Australia have a consolidated single place for best practice guidance to do AI safely and responsibly. Just as a glimpse over, and again, a teaser, because we're going to have a deep dive workshop and this webinar into the 10 guardrails. But the 10 guardrails are here. And so you see that the first one is really about accountability, governance, and ensuring regulatory compliance. That a regulation that already exists still applies to AI, but many businesses may not be considering it. The second one is around implementing and establishing a risk management process. The third one is around integrating AI into data governance, privacy, cyber governance. The fourth one is around testing of AI models and systems. The fifth one is really being mindful of your organization's decision around human control, intervention, and oversight. Depending on the use case, various of these options become really critical. The sixth one is around informing and transparency to end users who might be engaging with an AI system. The seventh one is establishing a process for individuals who might be impacted by AI systems to actually challenge those outcomes or ask questions how the outcomes were developed. The eighth one is around transparency across the supply chain, because really we know that every AI system is a coming together of many services, a lot of data and a lot of choices that the supply chain has made. And so transparency and collaboration across the supply chain is really critical. And the ninth one is keeping records to really allow third parties to assess compliance and potentially, this in some instances might be audits or tests. And the 10th one is about engaging stakeholders who are might be affected by the technology. They might be using the technology. Decisions might be made using the technology that would affect them. How do we do this in a consultative, connected, and co-designed way? So that's the altitude. I'm going to cover this because we will have a follow-up webinar. One thing to highlight from these is, while this is very much within reach for larger and some mid-size organizations, we know that many small and medium businesses would likely achieve this through supply chain and procurement contracts. And so there is guidance in the Voluntary AI Safety Standard for what actions to take if you want to achieve these standards through procurement. One final ask to everyone is we do have the mandatory guardrails consultation open right now. Please do submit your perspectives. We are absolutely listening and gathering all the feedback to shape the mandatory guardrails in legitimate high-risk settings to be that Australia's community and industry sees as the right thing to do. So please do submit. The cutoff is 4th of October. And a lot of these insights will also be shaping the way the AI safety standard evolves together with the mandatory guardrails. So that's all from me as the background. I want to hand it over to Steve Nuttall from Fifth Quadrant, who has led this amazing piece of work, the Responsible AI Index. So Steve, over to you. I'm not going to take your thunder, so please share a little bit more details with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stella. Okay, I'll spend the next 15 or 20 minutes taking you through some of the potted highlights taken from the Responsible AI Index report that we recently published. As Stella said, this is not the first iteration of the index. I think the very first conversation I had would have been around 2020 when Katrina Wallace approached us to develop the index. Chris Dolman, who's part of the panel, was also involved in those very early conversations. And the index has really kind of evolved quite significantly. This latest iteration has made it marks a significant change. It's a bit of an upgrade. There's a much greater focus on the adoption of a much wider range of responsible AI practices. And that's really kind of the focus of the index. It's about the different kinds of practices that your organization has implemented or plan to implement. We are looking to make sure that those practices align very closely as well with the AI safety standard. And in developing the areas of the different practice areas, again, similar to the process that Stella explained in terms of the development of the safety standard, we also went through a quite similar process when we were updating the questionnaire and looking at examples of international frameworks, and particularly kind of areas that give a very kind of practical and grounded approach to measuring responsible AI. And the index is very much about that. It's designed to really be a practical tool. It's meant to be a tool that organizations can replicate as well in the future and be able to benchmark. Now, I'm assuming lots of you have already downloaded the report and have downloaded the summary. But if you haven't, you can go to Fifth Quadrant's website. You can scan the QR code there that's on screen. That will take you to the landing page, and you can get a full copy of the report, and you can get a copy of the summary. As Stella said, it's a really detailed report. It provides lots of very valuable insights, and the index is grounded on a survey of just over 400 decision makers responsible for AI strategy. The sample excludes any organization that's not implementing AI, so it's very much those who are at different stages of AI implementation. We're also focusing somewhat on the bigger end of town, so we exclude smaller businesses with fewer than 20 employees. Now, separate question about how you would measure responsible AI amongst a smaller organization, but the focus is on any organization with at least 20 employees. Sample's pretty good in terms of spread by business size. We've got 27% from organizations with 1,000 employees or more. So pretty good representation, good geographic representation, and pretty much everybody who responded to the survey has significant influence over their organization's AI strategy. So let's jump into the index and look at how we built the index. So like I said, the focus is on different areas of responsible AI practices. We've divided those up into 5 areas. So the questionnaire asked whether you had implemented 12 practices in relation to accountability and oversight, 9 in relation to safety and resilience, 6 in relation to fairness, 6 in relation to transparency, and 5 practices in relation to explainability and contestability. So 38 different practices in total. If we kind of allowed each of those to fall out proportionately, then you'd give a lot more weight to accountability and oversight. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to ensure each practice area, each dimension carries equal weight. So essentially, we rebase those scores So each area being a score out of 20, you add those up and it gives you a score out of 100. Again, the idea is to design something that is relatively easy to explain and also something that is very easy to replicate, that we could take these set of questions and an organization could follow those questions and measure themselves and also benchmark their score. So if you've read the report or seen the summary, you'll know that the score, the RAI index score, the mean score is 44 out of 100. And that's based off the implementation of 12 practices on average out of 38. So that indicates that there's still a long way to go. And on average, there are 7 practices planned to be implemented in the next 12 months. So I think, media, we got a lot of good media reporting when this was launched. A lot of attention was focused on the fact that Australian organizations really are lagging. Now, the index, doesn't assess how well those practices are implemented or how consistently they get implemented. But the point is that at least you've identified that as a practice area and you have begun the process of implementation. Let's look at the distribution of scores and then kind of how we assess maturity. So, as I said, mean scores 44, 4 levels of RAI maturity. Most organizations are sitting in that segment, which we've called developing, and there's only 8% sitting in what we would call the leading group. Now, where we've set the bar for each of those segments, it's, to some extent, it's subjective, but we did look at, kind of what would you need to get into the leading group, to get a score of 70? What do you need to be doing? What do you need to be doing to be kind of getting yourself into an implementing phase? But also, if we look at the characteristics of each of these segments, we can also see that there are some quite marked differences, not only in terms of the number of practices that each of these have implemented, as you can see there. I mean, there's a real, step change as you start to go from implementing to being in the leading group. But you kind of also look at the challenges that they face as well, and the challenges reflect their level of maturity. So, in the emerging group, the issue is, you don't have leadership support, which means you don't have oversight. And fundamentally, you just kind of lack basic knowledge of what responsible AI is about. So, they are in a fairly kind of immature phase of RAI development. The developing group started to kind of grapple with challenges around how do I integrate transparency and explainability measures into existing systems, because generally we're not doing this from a blank canvas. We already have systems in place, and now we have to think about this challenge around integration. And then you move into the implementation phase, and it's more about, okay, now I've got to really start thinking about real kind of comprehensive data protection, not least because we're kind of starting to roll this out across the organization. We're starting to scale that. And as you do that and you're starting to move into that leading phase, then it's about, well, how do we maintain consistency in every part of the business, particularly for a very large organization? That consistency challenge is quite significant. And how do we maintain that strategic oversight whilst also scaling AI initiatives? If we move on to how it pans out by industry, I'm a little bit kind of cautious about how we interpret the industry data, just because the sample sizes start to get a little bit skinny. But it does look like that retail is significantly lagging behind other sectors. Professional services is marginally ahead, but essentially there's a bunch of industries that are all very kind of tightly grouped together, with the exception of that retail group. Okay, so that's the headlines on the index. So thinking about AI strategy and having a strategy for the development of AI that's tied to the wider business strategy. So not surprisingly, the leading group is more likely to have an AI strategy and tied to all organizational divisions. Why does this matter? It matters because the approach really kind of ensures that AI initiatives, they're aligned with business goals, they're promoting consistency, there's coherence, and there's enhanced organizational effectiveness as we begin to leverage AI more strategically. So it really does matter. And when we start to look at this in terms of, well, who's leading, who's responsible for driving the strategy in your organization? Over half of organizations, 54%, that have an enterprise-wide AI strategy have the business leaders personally invested in driving the strategy, compared with just over a third where the strategy is only tied to some division. So for me, that really underscores the importance of having the leadership on board, and on board early on in, really kind of early on in the process. I'm not going to go through all 38 practices. We'd be here all day doing that, and you can read the report. I just wanted to pull out what were the 5 practice areas that were implemented on average the most. And kind of what's interesting is that, in relation to the second, third, and fourth, second, third, and fifth on the screen there, they all relate to transparency. The first practice relates to explainability. So most commonly implemented practice about maintaining comprehensive documentation of the development process, data sources, model architecture, et cetera, et cetera. That's good. That's the most implemented process. And then we also have, in relation to fairness as well, maintaining rigorous bias monitoring practices, really to kind of, to reduce the risk of the bias introduced by scope creep. So conversely, the 5 least implemented practices, the top 4 all relate to accountability and oversight. So for me, that's quite a significant concern. I think the 5th one about assessing vendors' claim on AI model performance, that relates to safety and resilience. But to Stela's earlier point about the fact that in this country, generally speaking, we're a technology taker. That means that quite often we are reliant on vendor models and so on. The fact that this is low, even for the leading group, I would say is something of a concern. RAI principles. So we asked about awareness of Australia's AI ethics principles. Overall, 2/3 are aware. It's pretty good. Obviously, that rises across each of the maturity segments. But again, I think that's a good good result, I think, for the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, who have been working hard to promote these principles. This is where we have a real issue. This slide, and this is the slide, I think, and the data on this slide is probably what's being reported most in the media. Why? Because it's highlighting this really significant gap between a perception that AI decision makers have about how well they think their organization is performing across different areas of the different principles against what they're doing in practice. So the agreement question was a Likert scale of 1 to 5. So we've just combined those who agree or agree strongly. So that's what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the chart. Statements where people are saying, we agree that our organization, and this is specific to your organization, is doing such thing as generating quantifiable benefits and so on. And then you contrast that with the practice and the percent that have implemented the practice, and there is a real disconnect. There's a 40 on average. There's a 49-point gap between the average of the agree statements and the average of the organizations who've implemented those practices. It's what we're calling a say-do gap. And that's the gap that we really have to overcome. And the only way that we can overcome that is to promote more of the implementation of responsible AI practices. So that really is where the rubber hits the road. And then you kind of contrast that also with a question which was about, on a scale of 0 to 10, how do you rate your organization's capability to design and build a responsible AI system? And overall, the scores, a 7.5 out of 10. If you rate yourself 7.5 out of 10, you think you're doing a pretty decent job. You certainly think you're more than halfway there on your journey. And even the emerging group are giving themselves a score over 6, which clearly can't be reflected in terms of the practices they've implemented. So yeah, I think there's a real level of misplaced optimism, particularly obviously amongst those less mature groups in terms of how their organisation is performing. Moving on to outcomes, so benefits versus the cost. So to what extent, weighing up the costs and benefits of designing and building a responsible AI system. Look, on balance, most organizations would say that the benefits outweigh the costs, but that really steps up for the two more mature groups, particularly, for the leading group, who really see the benefits outweighing the costs. Why? Because you're seeing increased trust, you're seeing decreased regulatory risk, you're seeing increased resilience, and you're seeing increased innovation. What are the costs? More time, maybe some system limitations, maybe some issues around ongoing monitoring, maybe you need specialized expertise. But I think those who are particularly in that leading group recognize that kind of once you've absorbed those costs, you really start to reap the benefits. It's a complex question to assess, I understand. And I think the benefits really are thinking more about long-term benefits versus short-term costs. But I think it's positive, at least, that very few organizations are saying the opposite, that the costs outweigh the benefits. It's not a hard sell. And then when you look at this in terms of competitiveness as well, there's why do we think responsible AI gives us a competitive advantage, which is certainly what those in the leading group are seeing. Obviously, again, those elements of trust and regulation and risk mitigation, but also they can attract talent as well. It's a real draw card in terms of talent attraction. There may be short-term costs, there may be some short-term performance trade-offs, but I think on balance, I would say that those leading organizations really kind of see that it's a significant, not a slight, competitive advantage. Wrapping up now with a couple of slides around AI standards and so on. So we asked about awareness of the ISO AI Management System Standard. Pretty high level of awareness. I did kind of question whether that's a little bit overinflated. But again, we want to get a read on this because in future we'll want to track awareness of the voluntary safety standard and the guardrails. So I think it's quite positive. It's encouraging. Obviously, again, awareness increases. Those obviously in the early stages of their responsible AI journey have a lower level of awareness, but I think that's a positive. And then amongst those who plan to implement, those who are aware of the standard, again, awareness leads to a high level of intent to implement the standard. So I think that indicates a very strong foundation and a good level of readiness among Australian organisations to align with the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. So thank you very much. That's just a potted highlight of the report. I encourage you to download it and read it.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I've seen a lot of questions come through the Q&A tab. So I do want to encourage everyone, there is a little Q&A button at the top, and please do submit your questions about the Responsible AI Index or any of the topics we have been covering so far. We have a fantastic panel to actually capture your questions, and I will do our best to address them. So you've just heard from Steve Nuttall, Director of Fifth Quadrant. We also have Melanie Marks, Director of 11M. And 11M has been awarded one of the AI Adopt Centres, particularly in the area of responsible AI and AI governance. And we also have Chris Dolman, who's the Data and AI Risk and Ethics Principal at Telstra. And Chris has been involved in this report since the first day, I believe, across multiple organisations. And so it's really exciting to have such a fantastic panel with us. So I'm going to stop sharing so we could really spotlight our wonderful panelists. And I do have a question to get started with while folks are finding their Q&A. And maybe one, since Steve, you just presented the Responsible AI Index, how do you make sure that how do you measure that responsible AI isn't just like a checkbox or tick and flick exercise, but that the organization is actually committed to this ongoing monitoring and management of AI systems? Because I know how much we're finding that it's this ongoing commitment and monitoring that is really critical. So how do you try and draw that out in some of the insights that you've shared?
Sure. And like I said, I think, when we developed the questions, we consulted on international frameworks with a really kind of focus on practical implementation, and we set it up in a way that also incentivizes future adoption of AI practices. So if you haven't adopted, but you are planning to implement, that's good. And I think it's structured in a way to be very practical, and it's structured to make it easy to identify areas for improvement. Some of the organisations in your network completed the survey, and we went through a process where we looked at their individual responses, and we went through a kind of a presentation Q&A session with them. So it's all about kind of giving that feedback and then giving feedback. I've gone through a process also of mapping the practices in the index to the standard and the 10 guardrails, and sort of my conclusion of that is that it aligns pretty well with many aspects of the standard. I think it's strong on accountability, it's strong on risk management, it's strong on testing, transparency, contestability, and stakeholder engagement. I think it's moderate in terms of the explicit data governance, human oversight mechanisms, and supply chain transparency. I say moderate, it's not weak. So I think, overall, and comprehensive record keeping probably could be better. But I think we've done a pretty good job of setting a bunch of practices that align well to the standard. And kind of what it means from a practical basis, that if you then follow these questions as an organization, you look where your strengths and weaknesses are, you can then look at that to the standard. And if you're planning to adopt the standard, it gives you a pretty good read on that about what you need to do better.
Yeah, and you've touched on that closer integration that we are, I think, already starting to collaborate on when it comes to the guardrails, the Voluntary AI Safety Standard, and the Responsible AI Index. And also, I think we're seeing across so much of the guidance nationally and internationally that ongoing effort, commitment, and monitoring is really important. And, the AI systems are continually evolving as the data shapes, the objectives are shaping, the contexts are evolving. And so it's not a one and done. We understand how much the ongoing is needed, and we'll keep emphasizing that in how we're developing the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. Chris, I have a thought for you, because you have been involved in this since day one, and the evolutions and the research that went into it. What do you think is why do you think there's such a gap between what organizations believe they're doing and then what actually they're doing? And how do you think we can address this gap?
It's a really interesting one, because I think this theme came up in the first edition and the second edition, and you can see it again, right? So
are we at least narrowing the gap?
Well, I'm not sure, because we kind of changed, as Steve said, what the practices are, and I think that's great, right? As we've sort of learned how to do responsible AI better over time. But I think it's very easy to sort of nod along to high-level ethics principles and statements of intent. Like, that's a really easy thing to do. But actually committing to action is a lot harder. It's sort of a widely acknowledged problem that the high-level statements of intent don't really tell you what to do. Now we have all these frameworks, though, which is great, that have been coming out in the last 2 or 3 years. So things like the Voluntary Safety Standard, things like last year's report from the National AI Centre on implementing the ethics principles. That was, again, really practical advice. Last week, Telstra, along with the GSMA, published a Responsible AI Maturity Roadmap. Again, practical advice for people. So there's more and more things sort of coming out. But to take action, you've got to really commit to investing time, people, money. That's a lot harder than agreeing with a statement of intent. And I think that's why that gap's there. It's also, things have kind of moved over time, right? As Steve said, the first edition, we came up with some practices that we thought were reasonably reflective of the ethics principles. They're not the practices that are listed in the current edition, because our thinking's moved on about what good practice looks like. And so there's always going to be this sort of moving feast, I think. So I think it's actually become quite hard for practitioners to also keep up with what that best practice looks like, right? What best practice looked like 3 years ago is not what best practice is now. So you've got to put in a lot of effort to keep up. And that's, again, intensive. It's activity that you've got to undertake to do that. A newer challenge that we've really seen in the last year or two is also the challenge of scale, especially at a company like Telstra, where I work, which is a huge organization. It used to be the case that AI was, in most organizations, a small specialist team building AI systems or implementing them. We've now all got access to AI systems, right? As human beings on the planet with smartphones, we can all access things. So responsible AI now has to be very democratized. We've got to build practices that really apply to the masses, not just specialist data scientists and other folks who can really understand the technical detail. So the activities you've got to undertake are a little bit different there. One thing we've been doing is investing a lot in training, not just training of those sort of high-end experts on how to build AI systems responsibly, but also training of the broader population through our Data and AI Academy, so that when they, for example, get a license to Microsoft Copilot, which we've started rolling out, they don't just get told how to use it, they get told how to use it responsibly with a responsible AI training module attached as a condition of getting access to that tool. So it's practices like that we've really got to encourage, so that as the broader population starts using AI, they can do it safely, even if they're not an AI expert.
And that whole of company training, in different ways, because not everyone's going to be a data scientist. But we are starting to see more and more of that. We were actually quite impressed during last year's AI month that we saw several large organizations offer training for all of their employees to understand more about AI. And then for those who are in more technical fields or wanting to go there, there was more than deeper training as well. But it's fascinating to see. It's also one of the top recommendations in the government guidance, the policy for responsible AI use in government, and it's also in the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. And it's because there's this whole of economy, whole of system transformation that we all actually need to upskill. So lovely to hear that, Chris, from you. You also touched on the gap being due to the need of, having more practical details. And that's the frontier that we're on, and we're continually trying to do more. So I do want to encourage the audience to share with us, where are those practical areas that you need more guidance? We're also not wanting to reinvent the wheel, so we'll be bringing in other guidance. And it is a moving field. So it's also a field that has some inconsistent guidance, depending on who you talk with. Across the commercial sector, you might get a different framework or a different toolkit. And so I think it talks to a lot of our ambition at the National AI Centre, which is to convene and create this central place for the best practices. So Melanie, I might pass the next question to you, because I think it's a really interesting one, the topic of SMEs. And one of the slides that, Steve, I don't think you shared in this one, but it's in the full report that everyone can download. There's a slide which has the bell curve that Steve showed, and then it maps the maturity by organizational size. That one was incredibly revealing to me, because it said that the larger the organization is, the more mature they were in responsible AI, and the stronger they felt they had the capability and skills to actually implement responsible AI. And the smaller the organization was, the less mature they were in safe and responsible AI practices, and they also felt they had less access to that capability and skill set. And so, Melanie, I'm keen to know, what do you see from the index and from your experience that SMEs need more support and understanding in order to implement the responsible AI practices? What kind of support, what kind of initiatives are needed? What's your experience there?
Thanks, Stella. I think the short answer is a lot more. And we need to use some of those words like, I think Chris said, democratized. That's going to be key. What we can see from the data is that we expect that there's less mature adoption of responsible AI practices by small and medium enterprises. And importantly, as Steve outlined, the survey does not look at organizations with less than 20 employees. So I think if we went even further down the scale, we might see that trend exacerbated. Stella, you mentioned at the beginning that 11M is leading one of the AI Adopt hubs, sponsored by DISA, and that work is now underway. One of the milestones that we have coming up very early is to dive deeper into the experiences of small and medium businesses. So whilst the National AI Index has given us quite a lot of insights, we're going to take that research a bit further and undertake our own primary research, looking at what are the specific challenges for small and medium enterprise, including those really small ones, around moving principles to practice. So how do we get practical, and what are the differing needs of organizations with fewer resources? So one of the examples that Steve called out in terms of the least implemented practices was that bundle of practices around governance and oversight. Well, what does governance and oversight look like and require when you have 5 people working in the business? It's going to look very, very different. So we're really looking forward to undertaking this research. We can anticipate some of the trends, but we don't know all of them. So really looking forward to that. Love to hear from anyone on the call who'd like to participate in this in our server that dives a little bit deeper into that. Now, in saying that, you asked what kinds of resources we think will be most helpful, and I think that we can sort of flip that round and say, well, what were the 5 least implemented areas of practice? And Steve spoke to some of those. And we can say, well, for sure, those are going to be harder for SMEs, and what can we do to flip that around? Our hub, which is called SAM, it's not called 11M. It's SAM, SAAM. We've just launched on LinkedIn, so I'm not sure if we're going to be able to share that link now or maybe later. Our AI Adopt Centre, SAM, is an online hub which is accessible to all, hopefully helpful even to larger organisations and not just the smaller ones. And it will have tools and practical resources that bring some of these principles and frameworks and whatnot to life, and enable smaller enterprises to, really get those benefits, but understand how to minimise risk. So some of the things that we know we're going to produce, online tools to help SMEs know what questions to ask about AI solutions, and understand the risks that flow from that, and then guide them through steps on how to mitigate those risks. And then that should be supported by all sorts of resources like videos and webinars. We'll have a help desk in due course. That's a little bit later on for us. So our resources will be launched next year. As I said at the beginning, our first thing right now is that survey that dives a little deeper, and that's probably it, other than the call to action if anyone wants to be part of that.
Thank you for that, Melanie. And I think as well as you highlighting the areas which might need greater support of guidance, I think there is, from what we're hearing from SMEs, a need in how to actually then implement that guidance, because for some it might be in-house choices and implementation, and for others it might be through procurement and updating contracts and holding supply chains, suppliers accountable, and negotiating with vendors and proper vetting. So it's great to hear that there will be additional tools and resources developed. And in the meantime, I do want to emphasize that some of this is already available in the Voluntary AI Safety Standard, what kind of questions to ask of your suppliers and what to add into the contract. I think we have a couple of minutes for audience questions, and one that was submitted from John Gilbert is, do you see, perhaps in the near future, the development of an industry-supported AI capability maturity model for organizations to assess their current level of maturity and guide decision-making when it comes to uplifting maturity? Maybe we hear from Chris. Do you want to have a thought on that one?
Yeah, I dropped a link as a response to that question because I think, as I mentioned earlier, we, along with the GSMA last week, published a responsible AI maturity roadmap. So not AI as a whole per se, but responsible AI specifically. So that, I think that sort of resource is going to be really helpful. That was obviously built by and for telcos, but the principles are able to be adopted broadly. It's not really telco specific. So have a look at that. I'm sure there are going to be other frameworks like that that are not just standards, but actually roadmaps to help people implement coming out over the next little while.
And maybe one final question around the AI definition, Steve. I was seeing quite a lot of folks ask what AI definitions we were using in the index. Do you want to briefly chat through that? Because I know it wasn't a narrow AI definition, it was quite broad, but how are you thinking about that?
100%. Yeah, no, it was. I was just flicking through the questionnaire, actually, just going back. Yeah, no, we did ask a question about, I mean, we defined at the beginning what responsible AI is. We had a definition about AI at the start of the survey, and then we had a question about the different types of AI applications and that are being used by organizations. And we also asked whether or not that's developed internally or sourced externally as well. So we've got a pretty broad view of the different types. I mean, yes, you know, probably the highest, the most often used are large language models. That's the detail of that is in the report. But yes, we did look at AI more broadly, not a narrow definition.
Thanks, Steve. And maybe one final quick one, Melanie, for you. I know I keep saying final one, but the questions are too good. Melanie, one of the questions from Ruth was around this gap between the belief and then doing, and how, you know, why aren't we promoting the standards that already exist, and why aren't organizations using the standards that already exist? I think the example there was IEEE, but there are many other standards or guidance. So I want to up-level it into, why do you think there's so much great guidance happening out there? Why do you think that businesses aren't using it?
I think that businesses don't know where to start. That's quite honestly my answer. I think there's no lack of resources out there to get started, to understand the principles, to understand the frameworks. It's also a fast evolving space. A lot of the organizations we work with are multinational as well, so that throws an extra complexity into the mix. So I think that part of the work that you're doing, Stela, is really about you know, creating a one-stop shop and making it much easier for everyone to understand, well, where have we come from and where are we going, and how do we make this practical? So I think it's about reducing the noise rather than anything
I totally
else.
see that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mel. And just while I wrap up, if I could ask my team to load up the slides again, I totally see that, Melanie, as well, because there is so much guidance out there, but, you know, we are living and breathing AI, and it's challenging to keep up. So I can't even imagine what it's like for a business that has such a broader remit. And that is really why we're trying to create the Voluntary AI Safety Standard as this consolidation of best practice and guidance. If there are things that you want to see included, now is the time to tell us, so that we can incorporate into the second version. So as we wrap up, there are fantastic resources for you to continue the journey and find out more. You can scan some of these QR codes to get to the resources we have discussed, including the index, including this new SAM organization that Melanie was sharing, the maturity roadmap that Chris was referencing, and many others. I do want to highlight that just next month, on the 21st and 22nd of October, we have our third AI Leadership Summit. This is where business leaders gather to learn about best practices, learnings, what worked, what didn't work when it came to navigating their organization through this AI transformation. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, and I do want to encourage for folks who can join us in person, please do. There's also virtual participation that can be possible. And we will be also sharing this through email follow-up, so you'll have all the links there ready for you. Also, next month, from 14th of October all the way through to 15th of November, is Australia's AI Month. There's already a set of events in order to help uplift the understanding of AI and spotlight some of the great AI innovations across Australia. But also, if you are putting on an AI event and you want that amplified, please let us know so we can add it to the AI calendar. We know that, you know, we every year, the last 2 years has been basically an AI year, and there's a lot of events and activities. But if we can help to spotlight Australia's great AI innovations and help uplift and make more accessible the knowledge of AI, we would love to do that. So let us know of any events that you might have. And that is all from us from this first webinar since Nate is over on the Department of Industry side. Thank you so much for your support and joining us again. And we'll send an email summarizing all of these great links. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.